In 2009, Libyan leader and noted pan-Africanist Muammar Gaddafi stated, "I will fight for a greater voice for Africa. I am the king of kings of Africa, and my international status does not allow me to descend to a lower level." Gaddafi dreamed of uniting the entire African continent against future competitors, and regardless of your opinions on the deceased leader, his ambitions truly were larger than life, and he was in fact the man who near single-handedly was responsible for the creation of the African Union, which has had its successes and failures, and some have speculated on just how much of a behemoth of a country a united African continent could be. For all intents and purposes, this is impossible, and I'll state it outright. The African Union is light years behind the same integration seen in the European Union, or even another regional supranational organization like ASEAN, not to mention the extreme cultural differences across the African continent. But one topic that has become increasingly relevant in recent years is the further integration of Sub-Saharan African countries. This doesn't change the fact that outside of the United States and a few other English-speaking countries, the whole concept of the black race or black unity is a foreign concept, which is why I almost exclusively use the term Sub-Saharan African instead. Although being about 1/4 African myself, I and most of my family here in Texas use the term Black American to refer to the ethnic group that was created in the United States over the centuries through the fusing of many different African ethnicities from West and Central Africa, along with major input from European genetics and culture, and minor input from Native American sources. And yes, as I discussed in a previous video, Black Americans are an ethnicity, just as the Zulu, the Igbo, and Somali are ethnicities, even though the Black American identity was formed in a unique manner. Now, it is true that the genetic clusters that define these Sub-Saharan African races, such as Horn Africans, Nilotes, Khoi, and Bantus, are all closer to each other than to any population from outside the continent. However, the genetic distance between these various African groups is just as great, if not greater, than between the most disparate of non-African populations. Honestly, the thought that all Sub-Saharan African countries would unite on a premise as superficial as race is as completely absurd as the thought that all East Asians would unite because of race. But nevertheless, there have been movements aimed at this goal, mostly spearheaded in the United States, where racial politics takes on a completely different meaning than in the rest of the world. And let's go ahead and discuss some of the history of pan-Africanism and the logistics and statistics if such a scenario were to conceivably happen in the near future, similar to my videos on a pan-Hispanic, pan-Slavic, pan-Arabian, and pan-European scenario. The most likely scenario I see happening in our lifetime would be the unification of the East African community, a topic I made a video about a while ago, and for nearly a decade now, the EAC has been aimed at further integration of the 5 East African countries of Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, which forms quite the aesthetically pleasing shape for a new country. Well, up until the acceptance of South Sudan. Had European colonization not created the modern borders we see in Africa, most likely had the nations evolved into modern nation states naturally, we would see much more natural boundaries, more or less running along ethnic, linguistic, or religious lines, which is generally what we see in Europe today. Now, obviously, if this were the case, it wouldn't magically solve all of the problems of the continent, such as desertification, famine, disease, and poverty, but there would be decidedly fewer separatist conflicts, civil wars, and religious tensions, as can be seen in a country like Nigeria, where the northern half is dominated by the Islamic Hausa people, who also bleed into neighboring Niger, while the south is split between the Igbo, Yoruba, and others who are mostly Christian, and this essentially splits the country in 2 territories with vastly different laws and cultures. There are currently 49 separate countries and dependent territories in Sub-Saharan Africa and 4 main regions: Central, East, West, and Southern Africa, with each having a unique history, with many formerly being a part of the French, British, Belgian, Dutch, Portuguese, Italian, German, or Spanish empires, and the wave of anti-colonial movements that swept through the continent in the 1950s to 70s have greatly impacted the mindset of many in the region. As many know, Ghana was essentially the first colonized country in Sub-Saharan Africa to gain its independence, and the Ghanaian president Kwame Nkrumah envisioned the future continent of Africa as united through their common struggle for self-governance, and additionally there are countless Caribbean countries in the America with an Afro-Caribbean majority, and there are countries like Haiti mired in extreme poverty, and on the opposite end of the spectrum there's Trinidad and Tobago, one of the most successful nations in the Caribbean with a quickly growing economy. There are also some who have called Brazil a majority black country, which I personally find rather strange, as only around 20 to 25% of the country's gene pool is of Sub-Saharan African origin, although it is true that the majority of the country has at least some African ancestry, and likewise, even though the bulk of the gene pool in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico is of European origin, the majority of the population still has a good amount of African DNA through intermixing throughout the modern and colonial era. So most likely, if there was to be a large pan-African movement, it would probably involve the 49 territories of Sub-Saharan Africa, and although countries like Haiti and Jamaica have long desired closer relations with the land of their ancestors, it'd be highly improbable that they would be annexed into this new superstate. Because of the ethnic and religious hyperdiversity seen in the region, this of course would be difficult, but perhaps a unique system of autonomous regions and adequate representation borrowing from other large countries such as China and Russia could help stabilize this giant of a country. But just how large would it be? As of 2018, Sub-Saharan Africa had a mind-numbing 1,045,000,000 people, up from 850 million only a decade ago, meaning it would be a runner-up behind China and India as the most populous country on Earth. However, all of these people are spread out over 8 million square miles, or 20 million square kilometers, over twice as large as the United States, and 20% larger than the current largest country, Russia, which gives it a population density actually about the same as the American state of Kentucky, as there are high disparities between the Sahel, Congo, and Kalahari regions, and the vast urban sprawls in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa. The top 5 most populous countries in Sub-Saharan Africa make up nearly half of the entire population, and this is doubly true for the GDP of 4.3 trillion US dollars, wherein wealth is concentrated in large cities as well as countries with oil, with countries like Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola having large GDPs due to large petroleum reserves, although a large chunk of the population in these countries still live in poverty, with a minority holding most of the wealth. For such a huge and diverse country, choosing a single federal capital would be difficult, so one plan already implicated by several countries today is to establish multiple capitals. And in my opinion, the cities Addis Ababa, Lagos, and Johannesburg would be ideal for representation, and lying in 3 major regions of the new country would appease a large portion of the population. For the most part, though, there is relatively little internal migration between major regions in the continent of Africa, with the exception of West Africans, many of whom have migrated to the Gulf of Guinea and South Africa. Just because most Sub-Saharan Africans have dark skin, though, doesn't mean they're the same ethnically and genetically, and the region actually has far more immigrants than most people would actually expect, although undoubtedly speakers of the Niger-Congo languages, who have the standard African phenotype, would dominate the new country, making up 70% of the population, with large minorities of Horn Africans, Nilo-Saharans, and Chadic peoples. Other racially distinct peoples of much smaller numbers include the Khoisan of southern Africa, Pygmies of the Congo, Malagasy of the island of Madagascar, and the various Creole African peoples such as the Cape Coloreds, Cape Verdeans, and others of mixed European and African descent. Mostly located in the northern parts of the Sahel, Arabs, Berbers, Tuaregs, and others of Middle Eastern and North African descent number nearly 10 million in Sub-Saharan Africa and have been involved in separatist movements in Mali and Niger. And although their numbers are stagnant to dwindling in most countries, there are still an estimated 9 million people of European descent in the region, mostly in South Africa, of course, but with lesser known European minorities in Angola, Nigeria, Kenya, and Madagascar, and they are predominantly Afrikaners or British or French ethnic stock. Both these groups make up a little under 1% of the region's population, while Asian groups, mostly Indians, but also including a growing number of Chinese, number nearly 5 million, mostly in South and East Africa, although little known fact, the country of Mauritius, next to Madagascar, is mostly of South Asian ancestry with a minority of African Creole peoples. And this brings us to the religious demography of the region, and although estimates vary, it is clear that Protestant Christianity is dominant in the area, making up at least 40% of the population, although there is a large minority of Catholics at 17%, scattered throughout virtually all regions, while the bulk of Christians in the Horn of Africa have practiced Orthodox Christianity for nearly 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, it's actually predicted that Africa will become the future hub of Christianity in the entire world, quickly outpacing Europe, North and Latin America in only a few years. Owing to their proximity to the greater Middle Eastern region, Islam is naturally the second largest religion at around 30% and is actually dominant in most of West Africa, as well as being a huge minority in East Africa, especially the Horn, while only a very small minority consider themselves atheist or irreligious. It's hard to estimate, but it is clear that traditional African religions are quickly being replaced by Christianity and Islam, and although not claimed outright, easily up to 10% of the entire population still incorporates elements of animism into their everyday religious life, such as the belief in shamans and witchcraft. In order to help administration, there would need to be a lot of subdivisions, which could be drawn along ethnic lines like in Ethiopia, or be completely arbitrary, but currently there are over 400 first-level administrative divisions in the region, nearly 10 times as many as in the US. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into the various political systems present in the continent, spanning all around the political compass. But either way, it is clear that these sorts of pan-racialist politics very rarely ever take hold in countries, and it's beyond unlikely that a sweeping wave of pan-African nationalism would ever take over Africa, not to mention the differences in culture, religion, and language, which are quickly becoming far more important in Sub-Saharan African society. I hope you've learned a bit more about Pan-African ideologies and what an insane concept a Pan-African country would look like, and although it is clear that Pan-Africanism is probably not a viable option in the near future, it is interesting to think about. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts on this wacky scenario and whether you think it could ever work, and your thoughts on ethnic, racial, and other forms of pan-nationalism. And as always, this has been Mason. Thank you all for watching. Stay woke.